Welcome to the Art of Catholic podcast. I've got another great episode for you guys. My guest today is Father Gregory Pine, and we're going to be talking about a virtue that doesn't get enough play these days, but is extremely important. Now, Father Pine is a sharp cookie and has a good bit to say about virtue in general and one virtue in particular. And before we get into it, don't forget to sign up for the totally free Lenten streaming of my series, St. Teresa of Avila's 9 Grades of Prayer. Teresa is the doctor of prayer, and this study will rock your world. I mean, trust me, what she has to say is jaw-dropping. It can totally transform your prayer life, which is nothing less than your relationship with God. Now, I can't make you pray, but I can share with you what Teresa has to say about prayer, which again is incredible stuff. If you're not really praying, you're not really in relationship with God. So, sign up for the free streaming at scienceofsainthood.com. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, just click the link below the video. If you're listening to the audio, again, just go to scienceofsainthood.com. But you have to sign up to get them because they won't be up here on YouTube. The videos begin on Ash Wednesday, and after you sign up, we'll just email you the links right up to the videos or right to your inbox as they roll out during Lent. So you don't have to go looking for anything. But this is powerful, powerful stuff. So please sign up and tell your friends. But for now, let's get to the show. Welcome to the Art of Catholic. My guest today is Father Gregory Pine, who is not new to this podcast, and I'm happy to have him back. And he's here to talk about a forthcoming book on a topic that gets a pretty bad rap, even though it's pretty important. And that would be the virtue of prudence. Not the way necessarily that George Bush talked about it, but I think the world could use a little more prudence these days. And maybe Father Pine is too young to even remember the Dana Carvey reference. But those of you who are older would remember Saturday Night Live. Not gonna do it. Wouldn't be prudent. But let me give you the tale of the tape on Father Pine. He is a Dominican. He's an author. He co-hosts the podcast Godsplaining. And right now he's a doctoral student studying dogmatic theology at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland. He was also at the Thomistic Institute. He's already got his licentiate in Sacred Theology and Thomistic Studies at the Dominican House of Studies. And the book about which we are going to talk is appropriately titled Prudence. Choose confidently, live boldly, and it's published by Our Sunday Visitor. Father Pine, welcome back to the Art of Catholic.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Delighted to be here.
Since the last time you were on, you have moved to Switzerland, and I have to say that I am supremely jealous because during my graduate studies, I did the study abroad semester, through Franciscan University, of which you are also an alum, I believe. And I remember hiking in Switzerland, and it was my favorite country, I think, in all of Europe. And so have you been to the Kleinscheidegg yet? Have you hiked up that? Have you seen that?
Yeah. I was actually there last winter. I went up on snowshoes. And then there's a peak, like a doable peak, maybe like 500 meters up from it, called the Lauberhorn, where you're looking right on the three big ones of that massive, like the Bernese Alps. And so you're looking at the Munch, the Jungfrau, and the Eiger. And it's terrible. It's kind of like the type of experience that you'd see recounted in a 19th century German romantic novel. It's like, so yeah, it's a pretty place.
That's really awesome. I remember when I was up there, I was with my friend Michael Miller, who's been on this podcast as well. And while we were up, there's a little restaurant at the top. I think we took a train to Wengen and then hiked up from there. And there's this restaurant, an outdoor restaurant. And you have this hearty meal at the top of the mountain outdoors. And all of a sudden we hear this, and there's an avalanche, like, I don't know, a mile or so away. And we're watching these come down. We're like, man, this is crazy. And there was a hotel from like one of the James Bond movies or something that was up on a higher peak. I think it was on Her Majesty's Secret Service or something. And I'm like, man, it's just incredible. It was like a movie set. But anyway, that's where you're there studying theology. So I know your head is elsewhere. And one of the places where your head is in the virtue of prudence. And what I'd like you to do just to kind of kick our conversation off here is to just kind of give us a quick definition of virtue in general, maybe draw the distinction between infused and acquired virtue, just so people kind of have the foundation for which to go forward in our discussion of this particular virtue.
Sure. You'll often hear people refer to nature. So nature is kind of like a blueprint for what the human person is supposed to be and how the human person is supposed to be built. Lots of things have natures, but thinking here in terms of our human lives. And in order to, go from the blueprint to the finished product, and a really excellent finished product, we need to take certain steps, right? So if you think about it on the analogy of a building, you need to lay the foundation, you need to put up, whatever the studs, you need to put up the frame of the house, then you need to put up whatever, drywall and insulation and yada yada and thus and such. So you need like an integral whole at the end of the day if it's going to function as a house. And human nature is like that. We're made kind of like towards the goal, or we're made on the way, but we need certain perfections in order to fill out our humanity to make us what we're destined to be. And virtues just do that. So virtues, they make us good. They make us to act well. And a lot of those virtues are things with which we're very familiar, like faith and hope and charity, for instance. But then, some of them might be a little less so on our radar. Like magnanimity is a virtue that you'll sometimes hear people talk about, but not too often, that it's actually virtuous to desire great things worthy of great honors because they are great. So what these different virtues are for, kind of like drawing out what is good in our human nature and setting it in motion, because virtues are specifically concerned with doing good things. They're for the purpose of activity or for the purpose of operation, I guess. So then prudence specifically is about thinking well with an eye towards activity. So it's about thinking well with an eye towards how you arrange your life and kind of how you direct your life towards the glory of God, the salvation of souls, and everything else besides, right? All that falls underneath that. So that's maybe just like a little thumbnail sketch.
Is prudence something that we can acquire, and are the virtues something we acquire on our own, or are they given to us by God?
Nice. You're accustomed to asking people questions and then those people not answering the questions, and then you gently, kindly, patiently repeating those questions. Good man. You had asked about the difference between acquired and infused virtues, and I forgot because I am like an old computer with no RAM left these days. All I am is just a chapter writing machine. It's just like ka-chunk. I'm just ones and zeros.
I understand.
But so virtue is something that gets discussed in the pagan tradition. So before the incarnation, you have people like Plato and Aristotle and Cicero who talk about virtue. So it's the kind of human excellence that you can grow by repeated activity. If you want to be courageous, you just have to expose yourself to scary things, to difficult things, and then kind of force yourself, as it were, to soldier on, even in the midst of contrary or conflicting demands. So that would be an example of what we would call an acquired virtue. But with the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, we have revealed to us like a whole new world, as it were, of virtue. So there are certain virtues which God just pours into our hearts. It's not like a hostile takeover. It's something, obviously, that we welcome because it accords in a very deep way with who we are and what we're meant to be. So it's like the natural things, except that it's even more natural than natural things. I will just leave that paradoxical statement. I'll attribute it to G.K. Chesterton, even though I didn't say it, because then that gives me just blanket permission to keep on going. These particular infused virtues help us to attain often to higher goods. So, like thinking about the virtue of temperance, for instance, which is the virtue with which we control how much we take in, like food, drink, sexual intercourse. Okay. Let's say that you're trying to be temperate because you're dieting. All right. So you want to lose however many pounds. You want to lose 10 pounds. And so you're just being a little more careful about how much food you eat. All right. So that'd be an example of the virtue of temperance, specifically of the virtue of acquired temperance. But now let's say that you want to control your intake of food for the reason of, like glorifying God. Say there's somebody in your life who's going through a rough patch and you want to fast for her, for a particular intention for her. And so on Wednesdays and Fridays, you really only have one meal and then, a couple of small snacks, and you limit yourself to bread and water. So you're controlling your appetite for food. So it can be described as, it is temperance, but that's a temperance that comes from God, because the kind of rationale for it, or the inspiration for it, is something that just goes beyond human nature. It goes beyond something to which we have access by the light of our minds. We need a greater light, or a yet more perfect light that God alone can give.
So I guess Lent would be a great example of this too. So we are managing our intake, and we're doing it why? Not to lose weight necessarily. It might happen as a result, but we're doing it so that we can grow closer to our Lord. So there's a spiritual end here. God is the end. Now, when are these? So there's virtue we can acquire, and there's virtue that's given to us by God, and sometimes they come under the same name. So acquired prudence, infused prudence. But when are the virtues that are infused into us by God? When does this first take place?
So it takes place at baptism, which is, I didn't realize for a while, because when I was in confirmation class, people kept talking about how you get the gifts of the Holy Spirit. I was like, cool. Did I not have them previously? And I was confused about that. I subsequently learned I did have them. Thanks be to God. So yeah, at baptism, you get grace, you get virtues, you get the gifts of the Holy Spirit, you get the fruits of the Spirit, you get the Beatitudes, you get all kinds of good things with the catechism I'll kind of talk about in a whirlwindy type fashion. But then it's almost as if, what would it be like? I'm thinking of examples of European monarchies where like a 7-year-old is made the king of Spain. All right. So, like during the first however many years of his reign, he has a kind of protector. And oftentimes the history books will recount that person was manipulative. But that's besides the point. He has a kind of protector because it's recognized that he's got all this power, but he doesn't yet have a sense for, or doesn't yet have the habit of exercising that power. And so he's got time to kind of train himself up in the use of those gifts or the use of that power. So too with the life of grace, virtues, gifts of the Holy Spirit. It's all given to us at baptism. So I was baptized on, when was I baptized? September 11th, 1988. 1998, holy smokes, I'd be young. So I was baptized on September 11th, 1988. And on that day, I received this influx of grace, virtues, gifts of the Holy Spirit. But then I didn't, stand up after having been laved in the font and say like, all right, guys, it's time to go to work. I've got a mission and I am fully cognizant of that mission and I'm ready to see it through. Who's with me? No, I didn't do anything of note for like the next 6 years. And then everything I did after that was silly, stupid, and mostly regrettable, So you have to like come into possession of these gifts and come into the exercise or use of these gifts. So it's all given at baptism, but then it takes time for you to develop the habit of using those gifts.
Okay, so we have different categories of virtues in the Catholic faith. So we have the theological virtues, which are the highest: faith, hope, and charity, and everything is directed toward charity. And they're infused into us by God. And then there are the moral virtues, or human virtues, as they're sometimes called. And these are infused as well, but they don't have God as their direct object, right? As do the theological. So they prepare us for the beatific vision, but they aren't directly focused on the beatific vision. Now, most of the time, when you hear about prudence in particular, it's listed along with the moral virtues. You get a little more, you provide a little more distinction, a little more precision here, and you call it an intellectual virtue. Explain why it is that you do that in the book.
Yeah. So this is, again, it's Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, kind of get out ahead of it. And they list as intellectual virtues wisdom and understanding and knowledge and art, which is a longer discussion, which we won't have, and then prudence. And the reason why those would be qualified as intellectual virtues or be categorized as intellectual virtues is because they take up residence in the intellect, right? So they're virtues of thought, they're virtues of the mind. Whereas the other moral virtues that we talk about with more frequency, like temperance or courage, sometimes called fortitude, or justice, those take up residence in our appetites. So temperance and courage/fortitude take up residence in our emotions, or what St. Thomas will call our passions. And then justice takes up residence in the will, which is sometimes called the rational appetite. So prudence is often classed together with justice, fortitude, and temperance. Taken together, they're called the 4 cardinal virtues. And it gets treatment in Plato and in Aristotle in a particular way, and then again in Cicero. So they're kind of canonical, like you take them all together. And prudence is often named among those virtues because it's in dialogue with the appetites, right? So it's the intellectual components of our desire, right? So with our appetites, we desire good things, whether that be food, drink, sexual intercourse, or that be like the good of society, or like the worship of God. Like we have many things that present themselves to us in life towards which we tend, or towards which we incline with our appetites. But we need to sort out how we tend. We need to sort out how we choose amongst those things. And prudence is the virtue which oversees that work. So because it's all bound up with the appetites, we often class it among those moral virtues. Whereas like wisdom, knowledge, and understanding aren't so much bound up with the appetites. They're a little bit more of the armchair philosopher type virtues. And so they get their own kind of separate category, their own ivory tower.
One of the things that I do in the science of sainthood is when I'm describing the human soul, I kind of treat it like an upstairs and downstairs. And so the downstairs is where your emotions and your sensible appetites are down there. And then the upstairs is the intellect and the will, and which is where prudence kind of resides. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's referred to sometimes as the charioteer of the other virtues. And so it kind of guides and directs the other virtues, and it's easier to do that from up top, so to speak, looking down on the rest of those guys, as opposed to being down there in the mix with them. But let's go ahead and kind of pivot right into prudence itself, and give us a working definition of prudence.
Whenever I try to give a working definition, it's always too long, which is embarrassing. I'm like, oh, it's like super simple, super interesting. And now here is a sentence with 8 subordinated clauses as I try to encapsulate it for you. And people are like, dude, this man sits on a throne of lies. So my go-to right now is that prudence is the virtue which empowers you to be a protagonist in life. So prudence is the virtue which empowers you to be a protagonist in life. And if you want to like expand upon that, it's the virtue of practical wisdom, right? It's the virtue of like savoir-faire. It's the virtue which, gives you eyes to see and to sort. Or it's like the virtue of individual providence for your life. So these are just kind of like variations on the same theme. But in effect, it's just the virtue of kind of like simple everyday wisdom, just street smarts or something like that. Yeah.
Father Adolphe Tanqueray is a great 20th century spiritual theologian. He calls it an applied science. So it's basically taking, it lives in the intellect, and so it's applying that prudence in the intellect to your everyday decisions and things, so that you're making wise decisions as a habit of governing yourself. Now, you mentioned that it's a cardinal virtue. I think we mentioned that it's a cardinal virtue. Yep. What's the significance then of prudence as a cardinal virtue? What are the cardinal virtues? What does that phrase even come from? In fact, I think you and I might have even mentioned this in a previous podcast, but refresh everyone's mind, why are the cardinal virtues so important?
Yeah. They are so important for a variety of reasons. You can come at it from the kind of lexical or philological tack. So cardo just means hinge. So it's sometimes said that these are the virtues on which hinges the life, the good life, or these are the virtues on which hinge the doors to the good life, so that you'll hear that image used in a variety of ways. But basically, one thing we know about a hinge is that it's important. And if you don't have hinges on your doors, then it has 2 settings, either barely closed or basically broken. So these are the virtues which facilitate kind of ordinary workaday human life. And so we listed them as prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. And we typically put them in that order because it reflects the order of the different faculties of the human soul, or what we'll sometimes call the powers of the human soul. It reflects the excellence of the faculties which they perfect. So prudence is in the intellect, justice is in the will, and then fortitude and temperance are in the passions, which are sometimes kind of broken out into 2 different aspects, but that's probably beyond the scope of this conversation. But basically, if you're trying to live a good, healthy, happy human life, there are certain integral parts to it. Like it's not enough to say like, just be super pious and devout, because you stand a chance or you risk offending many, many people because you don't have any like courtesy, or you're not polite, or you're not responsible, or you don't keep up your end of the deal. You're just like always sloughing off commitments to go to the adoration chapel, or like your children look totally unkempt and poorly dressed because rather than work for a little extra money, you're just like on your knees doing the miraculous medal novena day and night, which are praiseworthy things. But we can't just put all of our eggs into the basket of one virtue, because human life is more rich, it's more complex. It's just more than that. So yeah, so the cardinal virtues kind of pick out those most basic human excellences, which pull together a good human life, pull together a kind of integral human existence. And I think it's for that reason that we give them so much attention.
You know, I mentioned at the top of the show the famous George Bush line, and I don't know, you might be too young to even remember this. I don't know if you've ever seen this Saturday Night Live bit where Dana Carvey does this. Do you even know what I'm referencing when I bring that up? Okay,
I do,
good.
yeah.
You're not that young then, or reruns, right? But I think, you know, that's what we equate prudence with, the not going to do it wouldn't be prudent line. And I think, prudence has kind of gotten a bad rap because we tend to equate it with selfish concern for our well-being, and it's almost like the virtue of fraidy cats, you know, in popular culture. But that's not really the case, is it?
That is not. And you can come at this from a variety of different angles. And one thing that I like to do is just highlight the different parts of prudence. So sometimes when St. Thomas describes a virtue, he'll just break it out into its different component parts. He says, like, all right, what we got here is a car. So let's take a look at the chassis, the axles, transmission, the alternator, the engine. Let's take a look at all the major parts, because then when we put it back together, we'll have a better sense of what's going on under the hood, as it were. So when he breaks prudence apart, he says, you know, there are all of these different excellences that go to make it up. One, he says, is docility. Like, you need to be willing to listen to people who have been through it before, people who are maybe older, maybe wiser, etc. Another thing he says is memory. He says you need to be able to retain a good sense of the experiences that you've had in life. You need to be able to sort them too, so that way you're not just repeating a kind of dubious history time and time again. And then he'll talk about like shrewdness. And this is the type of thing that catches people off guard, because shrewdness is the ability to make snap judgments about what you ought to do. All right. So maybe you've been in a situation where you heard like a loud noise, like you're walking down the street in Steubenville, you hear a loud noise. It's like, oh, I guess that was a car accident. And like most people in the street are just completely frozen. But there are occasionally some individuals who just hop too, right? So like the priest comes with his oils and asks if anyone needs to be anointed. The firefighter comes and makes sure that nobody moves the guy in the passenger seat because it looks like he suffered distress, which may be a neck or back injury. Like there are certain people who just have a sense for the judgment that needs to be made. St. Thomas acknowledges that as a part of prudence, something that goes into prudence, something that we need to work on, something that we should seek to develop. Which is fascinating because we usually think about prudence as thinking about something for a long time and then saying no, which is not
so true.
Right? It's not. St. Thomas, to refer to prudence in shorthand, he says it's the virtue which commands, because there are lots of virtues which go through options. There are lots of virtues which make judgments, but he says it's only true of prudence that it commands you to act in real time. So when you start sorting through the different parts of prudence, I think it helps to fill out the picture as to what it is and how it works.
I think a lot of the problem that we have with prudence today, another issue we have with it, is that the idea of freedom for the world is the right to do whatever it is you want, instead of the right to do what's good. And really, I mean, prudence, I think lots of times prudence is seen as an enemy of our freedom to express ourselves. But that seems absolutely backward, doesn't it?
It does. No, yeah, for sure. And that distinction that you draw is kind of classic and probably like the last 40 years of conversations like in and among moral theologians, but more broadly for a popular audience. And there's a Dominican of the last century, Father Servais Pinckaers, who kind of popularized that distinction. But yeah, I think a lot of us think about freedom as I have a lot of options and I can do whatever the heck I darn well please. Whereas truth be told, freedom is for, right? Freedom isn't from. Freedom is for excellence. So we want to be empowered to choose what's good. And in order to be empowered to choose what's good, we need to build up virtuous habits. Because we're not just born in such a position that we're like always and everywhere poised to do the good. We have to develop that capacity, which is just what virtues do. And so prudence is the type of thing that says like, okay, this contributes to my good, this contributes to my good, and this contributes to my good. How do I go about ordering these things so that I'm not just, running from one to the next, but they all fit together in the makeup of, or kind of like in the edifice of a good human life, right? It's not enough to say like, I affirm this and I affirm this and I affirm this, because squirrels do that. Squirrels are like 1 acorn, 2 acorns, 3 acorns, 4 acorns, so it's like, that's not what we're called to as human beings. We're called to like make providential decisions about the whole of our life, insofar as our life is maybe tangential to or bound up with the lives of other human beings, so that together, whether it be, hand in hand or arm in arm, we proceed towards the goal, which is not just like accumulating a lot of acorns. It's the glory of God and the salvation of souls, which is a far more creative, far more interesting thing. So yeah, prudence has a way of like actually orchestrating the human drama so that it's more rich, so that it's more textured, you might even say.
It's interesting because you're talking about exercising prudence, and when we're talking about exercising and making wise decisions, we're assuming, and maybe we shouldn't, but that we are well formed already, right? So we're making wise decisions about what? Because the inputs that we have to determine all of these decisions, lots of people think they're being prudent and they're not, because they're not already well formed. There's a deep connection between having this formation already, which is one of the reasons why we get all the virtues, right? It's not just one, piecemeal, and they grow, kind of in harmony with each other. But I mean, comment on that. I mean, we have to be well formed, right?
Yeah. And I think that to be well formed is a lifelong project. It's first
Truly.
God's project, right? It's a project to we consent. It's a project with which we cooperate. But we are on the way, and we're going to be on the way until such time as we die or Jesus comes back. But prudence is the virtue that equips you for life on the way, because effectively you're responsible for being as prudent as you are advanced, So like you wouldn't expect a 12-year-old to evince the same type of prudence as a 24-year-old. You would expect a 12-year-old to be a little bit less reflective, a little bit more rash or more meek or whatever it might be, You would just expect certain deficiencies to creep in on account of the fact that this person hasn't experienced life, isn't especially well disposed to the counsel of other human beings, just hasn't lived. And so I think that like prudence comes with it, or there comes with prudence a kind of encouragement to ongoing formation. Not just in the sense like you need to get a subscription to form.org and watch a show like every day, but formation in the more embracing sense. Like we should be constantly looking to reality as a source of, kind of wise input. We should be like, okay, this is what I did. How did that go? What can I do better? Mindful of the fact that it's not all up to me, but like, how can I be open to God as he gives indication, as he clarifies my own motivations, and as he encourages me to take the next step. So yes, formation is huge, which is why when a lot of people talk about conscience instead of prudence, you lose some of the dynamism that prudence brings with it, because prudence is a virtue. So it's for acting, and acting brings with it this kind of like reflex of, all right, what just happened? How do we go about it next time? Whereas conscience is like a kind of act whereby we make particular moral judgments, but those acts aren't necessarily for, like future operation. They're just for evaluation. You can do them beforehand, you can do them after, but they don't translate immediately into action in the way that judgments of prudence do. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because prudence and all the virtues don't exist in a vacuum. They have to be wedded to a life of prayer, as you just referenced, that you have to be wedded to the sacramental life. That's how they're empowered, and that's how you grow in these things. But we also have to recognize that when we are acting prudently as Catholics, the reality is we're going to be at loggerheads with the world, more than likely. I mean, Jesus said in the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek. These are things that, the world doesn't hold those things in value, but we do, because Christ is leading us down this road toward him. And so when we're acting prudently, we have to be okay with the fact that we're going to come into conflict with the world.
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, it's like sometimes intimidating or discouraging to acknowledge that fact, but it can also be clarifying, because I think part of the reason that we find decision making so difficult is because we think about it in terms of maximizing or optimizing consequences, right? We kind of treat ourselves like technicians of reality. It's like, all right, I have to manipulate or control whatever forces fall within my compass or fall within my power so as to produce the best imaginable outcome. But I mean, one, that's impossible. But two, like it ends up with a kind of approach to reality which doesn't actually trust in God's providence, because you're like, okay, God's put it in my hands. I'm a secondary cause. I will do everything. I will act as if everything depended upon me and pray as if everything depended upon God. But oftentimes what it results in is a kind of quiet despair. It's like, I did everything that I could, but things are still bad. It's like, yeah. That's part of the deal. Why? Well, because we're called to be virtuous, right? We're not called to produce particular results. And oftentimes you hear St. Teresa of Calcutta quoted on this, like you're called not to necessarily be successful, but faithful. And when you think about that, the virtuous life, the main fruit of the virtuous life is that you yourself are kind of like drawn in to a relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ. So if good things come about from it, God be praised, right? And you're going to do everything within your power to try to see some of that through. So it's not enough just to have good intentions, to say like, I have a couple of things to say about Jesus, so I'm going to record them. I'm going to post them on SoundCloud. I'm going to tell no one, not tag it, and do nothing else because I know they will be discovered because they are for his glory. It's like, no, you have to promote it, big fella, or otherwise it will have been for nothing, right? So it's not enough just to have good motivations. You need to deploy that in virtuous agency with the recognition that the goal is to become more virtuous so that you get a knack for this humanity, so that as you continue to live it, you become yet more and more perfectly an instrument in the Lord's hands.
Now that's beautiful. And you referenced something I think is really important. That we tend to think that as long as we're in the will of God and we're seeking the Lord's will, that everything's going to work out, right? Everything's going to work out perfectly. But the reality is we live in a fallen world, and even when you abandon yourself into the hands of God, it's messy. It just is, because we live in a messy world, not because of God, but because of us. And prudence is what helps us to make decisions in the midst of this mess, always relying on the fact that if we are abandoned to the Lord, he's going to write straight with our crooked lines, and he's going to guide us down the path that he wants us to go. But we need prudence in order to sift through all the garbage that we encounter. And one of the things that you did in your book actually was you focused in on the idea of the present moment. And I heard echoes of like Father Jean-Pierre de Caussade and Father Saint-Jour, Trustful Surrender to Divine Providence, that kind of thing. Why is living in the present moment vis-a-vis the virtue of prudence so important?
Yeah, I think that oftentimes we imagine that our real life is elsewhere. Like we tell ourselves things will be good or things will be better just as soon as, and then, you fill in the blank as you see fit. But as soon as I graduate, or as soon I'm done this chapter of my dissertation, or, like as soon as I'm back in the United States. Now I'm just listing things about myself. Like whatever it might be, we kind of give ourselves a horizon beyond which we think things will improve. But I think that's a lie of the evil one to distract us from the way in which the present is truth-bearing and grace-bearing. Because it's only the present is true in a certain regard, and only the present bears grace. And I think that if it is the case that prudence is a virtue of practical wisdom, it's the virtue that empowers you to be a protagonist in your life, then it means owning the present moment, not as your own invention or creation, but as God's gift, right? And giving yourself to it, because your happiness and your holiness are not to be found like over, under, around, in spite of the present circumstances. Your happiness and holiness is to be found precisely in and through the present circumstances. And prudence is the virtue which gives you the wherewithal to just wed the present moment. To just say like, this is what you are giving me, Lord, and I love it. I will drink this cup to the dregs. I will drain every last drop. Does it seem to be terrible? Kind of prima facie? Absolutely. But I know that you address it to me in love, or you permit it to be addressed to me in love. And as a result of which, if I go through it, I will find you on the other side of it in love, for love, with love. And I think that imparts a real profound sense of, hope and kind of courage for the journey.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to make, because at the end of the day, if you really kind of want to boil it down, prudence is what helps us to apply the love of God in the moment in which we are living, because we can't merit in the past, we can't merit in the future. We can merit and we can order our actions in this very moment. And this is the only moment in which we can do that, because this is the moment in which we find ourselves right now. How does someone know? Let me kind of maybe wrap up with this question and have some practical advice from you with regard to prudence. How do we know if we are acting prudently?
I think that it's kind of like, how do you know if you're in a state of grace? The kind of straightforward answer is you don't. The more complicated answer is you can get a feel for it, right? Because grace is invisible, right? It's immaterial. And so they're never going to invent a grace meter where you can hook yourself up, or like on your Apple Watch, you can download an app that gauges how many grace points you've
terrible.
accumulated over the course of the day. Oh yeah, big problem, right? So you can't know it with that kind of mathematical certainty. You can't see it by virtue of a demonstration or by virtue of an observation, but you can observe its effects in the world. All right. So like fidelity, right? Like sometimes I feel nothing in religious life, like less than nothing. Like I mentioned the fact that my present chapter of my dissertation is a little bit difficult, right? And like I'll go before the Blessed Sacrament, I'll just be like, bleh, like that's the substance of my morning offering. Bleh. But I keep showing up, and I know that I am not a sufficient principle to account for the fact that I keep showing up. So that seems to testify to the operation, the working of grace in my life, which encourages me on reflection, right? So St. Thomas will, he talks about this in the Prima Secunda and the Treatise on Grace, question 109. And he says, you'll be able to see its fruits. And this logic is just taken from 1 John, like you'll be able to see its fruits. So are you faithful to prayer? Are you faithful to the sacraments? Are you growing in Christian friendship? Do you have a desire for, and maybe even a little bit of incorporation of penance in your life? Do you feel yourself called to, and do you enjoy studying the faith? Are you moved or prompted to serve the poor? Like, are these things kind of present, even if in a way that's not like wholly thoroughgoingly habitual? If they're present, then I think that indicates that grace is operative in your life in some way, shape, or form. And when it comes to prudence, I think that you should be able to observe a growing facility, not in the case of grace with like the spiritual life in general, but a growing facility with choosing, a growing facility with like living your life from decision to decision, such that it doesn't become isolated moment after isolated moment of moral anguish, but that it becomes more kind of whole cloth, living towards God with the recognition that there might be difficult decisions to be made along the way, but without being undone by them or completely bowled over when they arise. Because you begin more to think along the lines of like, who do I want to be on the other end of this particular choice, rather than like, what's the optimal choice and how do I make it in this, like fewest amount of minutes. So I think that, it will actually show itself by its fruits. And one of those fruits is a kind of integrity in your approach to the moral life, which is less like atomized and more so continuous and integral.
So I lied. I said that we were going to kind of wrap up with that, but I thought of another question I want to ask you with regard to this. So
nice.
Given the fact that prudence is something we act out in the present moment, and yes, it resides in the intellect, so kind of in the upstairs of the soul, but is it not true that our own physical condition, because we are a union of body and soul, our own physical condition is going to play a role in our ability to exercise prudence correctly?
Yeah, that's undoubtedly the case. So while the intellect does not rely upon a bodily organ for its exercise, it can be obstructed by, a bodily organ for its exercise. And insofar as prudence is in conversation with the appetites, if you have some, like bodily defect, for instance, which causes your appetites to function suboptimally, then yeah, that's going to play itself out in prudence.
Like if you're really tired, for example, right? I mean, it could
absolutely.
be lack of sleep. It could be all kinds of different things that would kind of impinge upon your ability to act prudently. Go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Yeah.
And like that's so that I think that's so. This is why I'm not discouraged by that revelation. So everyone, every Christian has a past, and I think in today's day and age, a lot of Christians have a somewhat sad sexual past, often one marked by addiction, whether it be like pornography and masturbation, things of that sort. But I think most Christians find themselves in a position where they are still healing. Okay. And I think that when you're in that position, you feel like you're not able to live the fullness of the life to which you feel yourself called. Again, I think that this is why another reason why prudence is so fruitful for meditation and for action is because prudence doesn't concern itself with what you could have done. Right? It recalls memories of past things insofar as they inform present decisions, but it's for now. And prudence proceeds with the confidence that God has given you what you need to proceed in the present moment towards him who is the fullness thereof. And I think that, so like regret, for instance, is not a prudent sentiment. It's not, in fact, a Christian sentiment, because the regretful person looks back on the past and says, would that it were otherwise, or would that it were undone. Whereas the prudent person like looks to the past with a kind of spirit of penitence. Yes, hateful of sin, sorrowful regarding sin, but with a sense that like God is present somehow, mysteriously, whether permitting or goading or inviting or turning or converting or yada yada. And he's leading me to here so that here and now I can live my life towards him, like siempre adelante, nunca atrás. So I think that like the prudent person is not past haunted, right? The prudent person is forward looking, but present. And and so yes, there may be things that make it difficult for you to be prudent, right? But God gives what he commands, and he commands what he gives, or excuse me, he commands what he Domine quod iuvere. There's a saying of St. Augustine with respect to God's love of us and the way that he apportions his grace, which I think goes like, God, give what you command and command what you will. That is it. So God will provide you with all that you need in order to live the life and vocation to which he is calling you at present. All right? At present.
Yeah, I mentioned how prudence seems to be directed toward our ability to move toward love. You in the book start with the idea of happiness. And really, prudence is what leads us and guides us to happiness. It seems counterintuitive just because of the modern conceptions of prudence, as we mentioned earlier. But really, at the end of the day, I'm assuming, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is one of the reasons you wrote this book, is because as Christians, we should be joyful. Right? We have everything given to us. We have the Spirit acting in us now to live good and holy lives. We're ordered to something that is beyond our wildest dreams. And I was very happy to see you mention, and I shouldn't have been surprised because it's you, right? But you talk about deification and divinization and the fact that we participate in the divine nature of God. And for me, this is the public secret of the Catholic faith. Just not enough people actually realize that this is the end goal, that we're not just trying to escape hell. We are made for something that we can't even fathom, says St. Paul. And prudence is this virtue that guides us toward this unbelievable end. And if you want to be happy, then you need to practice prudence. You need to grow in virtue. You need to have the life of prayer. But really, happiness is what all of this is ordered to, isn't it?
It is indeed. And I think that, sometimes people are, they'll reflect on the fact, this kind of grandiose promise that the Lord calls us and apportions us an abundant life, and then they'll compare it to their experience, and they'll feel like, wow, doesn't check out, doesn't seem like I am enjoying at present what God has promised that I ought. And so here, I think it's helpful, like in the first chapter, I do a little bit, just to talk about it in more, not like modest terms, but to talk about it in terms that correspond more closely to our experience. I think that every Christian can live and abide in the conviction that he or she was made for this moment, right? You see sometimes that quote of St. Joan of Arc put on t-shirts or other different things that you can buy on cool stores. But it is for this moment that I was born. I think that it's a profoundly and kind of foundationally Christian sentiment to recognize that God has made me for this moment, just to be in this moment and then to act in this moment, and that his glory is somehow reflected, made manifest, or magnified by the fact of my being and acting in this moment. And I think, because of the way in which it empowers us to live, right, and to live freely and boldly, I think that prudence is just poised to communicate this to every aspect of our life. So whether we feel super joyful, I feel like I'm always smiling as I am laboring at my desk to write this chapter about the dynamic, exemplar, efficient causality of the mysteries of the life of Christ. Spoiler alert, right? I know that I fit, right? I know that I am supposed to be here. I know that this is for God's glory, for the salvation of my soul and the souls of those to whom I am sent. And that gives me a sense that had I 1,000 lives to live, I'd be completely content to live this one every single time, because it's for this that I was born. So Amen.
That's beautiful. Again, the name of the book is Prudence, Choose Confidently, Live Boldly. I'm glad you took time out of your doctoral work to write this little book, and it's a fun little read. And I was telling Father before we actually began recording that I try and read as much of the books of the people that I interview, and I want to learn. I want to know exactly where they're going and with their arguments and such. And this was a personally helpful book because it helped me step back and ask myself some very deep questions about what's my life ordered to. The things that I am doing, are these not just the things that I want to do? Are they the will of the Lord? And are they guiding me to happiness? And by happiness, I really mean eternal beatitude. and am I living out my vocation the best way that I should be as a husband and a father and just a Catholic man? So I want to thank you for writing it. It's published by Our Sunday Visitor. Where's the best place for people to grab it? I know it's up. It's available right now as we record for pre-order on Amazon. When is it actually published?
I think it's available to ship on April 18th, so Easter Monday. But,
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah, the best place, the easiest place is just Amazon at this point.
Okay. Well, great. Well, thank you very much, Father. And, when your doctoral studies are over and you find yourself not going bleh all the time again, I would love to have you back on the podcast.
Thanks so much. I greatly appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
God bless. I hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to sign up for the free Lenten streaming of St. Teresa of Avila's 9 Grades of Prayer as well. Either click the link by the video or simply go to scienceofsainthood.com. But don't forget to spend some time in prayer as you prepare for Lent this year. Don't just do the same old thing just because you've always done it. Really seek the Lord and ask Him what He wants of you this Lent. Don't forget, we mature and change, which means the things with which we deal in Lent should probably change as well. And tell me that St. Paul doesn't always seem to nail it, no matter what part of the liturgical year we find ourselves. But Romans 12:12 just seems so incredibly appropriate as we head into Lent. So let's say it together as we wrap up this episode. Rejoice in hope, endure in affliction, persevere in prayer. God bless, and I'll see you on Ash Wednesday for the free streaming of St. Teresa of Avila's 9 Grades of Prayer.